Welcome back, students, to another Sitcast. This episode finds us returning once again to England for some more executions. I was going to come up with some phony sponsor, but I was actually thinking of possibly using some type of axe company. Not that I know of any, but I kind of realized that in today's world, this is extremely way too sensitive and didn't want to come across to you as politically incorrect. I mean, this painting right here on the main slide is probably going a little bit too far itself. If you kind of look at what's going on here, it's actually live action footage of King Chuck's beheading. There's a dude holding his head. Looks like somebody's in the crowd like saying, "Can I touch it?" And then here's his dead head as well with the executioner. But hey, just saying, what fun we could have had with that phony sponsor. Let's kind of review some of the social things that were going on in England around the time of where this new political elite is developing. And with companies, banks, and the commercialization of agriculture that we had talked about previously, the economies in Europe completely changed. They even spawned a new class of people in England, and I had introduced this to you when we were talking about religion in England and the Netherlands, but this new class of people were known as the gentry. The gentry in England were a group of self-made people who had become rich and powerful through being merchants or the commercialization and or trade. They came to dominate the House of Commons in England and were commercially very, very successful. They were heavily involved in ensuring that the king followed the rules and followed legal precedent that dated back to the Magna Carta in 1215. They were willing to pay taxes as long as they had some say in how the money was spent and how much their taxes were. But the problem initially was that this new group of people, despite being the richest and wealthiest in England, had very, very little, almost no political power in the government. Most governments at this time, as we've talked about, were run by hereditary nobility or hereditary kings, ones who had inherited and not necessarily earned their power. So over the course of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the gentry in England would fight with voting, but also with violence for more political power. And that is what the story is in regards to this Sitcast. So let's talk a little bit about some background that'll help you understand this story. As we know, Elizabeth dies. She's the Virgin Queen. She dies childless. So the Tudor dynasty is dead, and it goes to the Stuart dynasty. The first in the fine line of the Stuart dynasty, if you want to call it that, was James the First. We talked a little bit about him in class. So after James, who was kind of tolerated and really not immensely popular, Charles actually initially was somewhat popular when he took the throne. Unlike his father, Charles was noted as being personable and dignified, temperate, and level-headed. He also won popularity with his anti-Spanish policies. He was 5'6", but by the time he died, he would only be about 4'8". Get it? Because, anyway, sorry. You'll see why if you don't get that joke in a minute. But he tried at least to come across that he was for the common people initially. However, problems soon popped up for Chuck the First. He proved to be even more inflexible and more inept than his father. He did definitely subscribe to the idea of divine right monarchy. In fact, he was more pro-Catholic than even his father. He had married Henrietta from France, the daughter of Henry IV and the sister of Louis XIII, which is kind of creepy if you think about it. But anyway, that's what happened with monarchs back then within the family. But how about your name is Henry and you name your daughter Henrietta? That's sweet. Anyway, so he marries Henrietta, and a lot of people, it's kind of like going back to when Queen Mary was married to Philip II of Spain. Many were worried that he'd instill Catholic reforms, Bloody Mary style. So many were also upset that this union would also possibly mean automatic aid to the French crown. And the French crown, under Richelieu at this time, were assaulting Huguenots or Calvinists. And again, remember, Calvinism is very strong among the Brits. But Richelieu's attacking Calvinists, trying to strip away some of their protection rights that were granted to them by the Edict of Nantes at the city of La Rochelle. Also, the fact that this has increased the likelihood that his kids would grow up Catholic in France, and they would eventually be the future rulers of Britain. So people were alarmed by this union with Henrietta. He was also involved in a war with Spain. And again, this was initially popular because, well, if you're British, you love to hate Spain, going back to the Armada, so on and so forth. His dad, James I, had committed troops to help his brother-in-law, if you remember in the 30 Years' War, the Frederick of the Palatinate against Ferdinand. But when Frederick was blasted at White Mountain and lost not only Bohemia but the Palatinate, Charles pledged to support and declared war on Spain and Philip IV for assisting Ferdinand. So Charles also thought that this would deflect some of the growing concern of his Catholic marriage. But nonetheless, this was a huge problem that we will address in a minute. And even more appalling at first were the religious differences between Charles and the people of England. Parliament, which composed of some of the nobility, and the nobility had converted to Anglicanism under Henry VIII, but Parliament, by the time Charles gets into the throne, between 1625 and 1649, was composed of many Puritans, known as English Calvinists, or English Calvinists known as Puritans, and Presbyterians, who were English Calvinists who favored the Scottish Presbyterian organization of John Knox. Nonetheless, we have Calvinists in Parliament. William Laud, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1633 to 1645, opposed a lot of the reforms, radical reforms that Puritans had wanted. William Laud was influenced by his desire to impose total uniformity, not the tolerant style of Elizabeth, on the Church of England. He thought that it was his job to kind of use the church as a tool of absolutism, which has been going on in Spain for years, but also was starting to be established under Richelieu, under Louis XIII, and Cardinal Mazarin, under Louis XIV in France. But he believed that this was the official duty of his office to bring uniformity to the crown and to England. So he enforces strict observance of the Anglican doctrine, worship, and church organization. And really his drive is to drive the Puritans from the church. To those even with slightly differing views than the Anglican view, he used persecution. This and his support for King Charles I resulted in his beheading in the midst of the English Civil War that we'll talk about here shortly. But right off the bat, Charles is aggravating people with his support of the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud. Also, there are further clashes and further tension that's going to be problems for Charles I. The Duke of Buckingham, Charles' most trusted advisor. Really, people thought the Duke of Buckingham was really at the head of the government. And this is never a good thing if people perceive you to be a puppet and the person pulling the strings is not very good. So this guy was hated by the gentry in Parliament. Number one, he was supposedly the lover of James I. Again, that's kind of a legend. I don't know if that's something that we can prove, but this is what people thought at the time. And he had become rich through his role with James I. He was in charge of granting monopolies and other royal patronage, which was perceived as being corrupt. And if you think about it, monopolies dished out by the crown are really, really hated by the gentry, who were more capitalistic in nature, and they're commercialized people that are making money and competing with some of the monopolies granted to the crown. So there's added tension there. And number three, he also played a role in the marriage of Charles to the Catholic Henrietta of France. Spain. On top of the religious disputes that were lingering with the involvement in the war with Spain and all the things going on with Archbishop Laud, the Duke of Buckingham gets involved and wants to do things his way. Basically fights his own war with Spain, and it wasn't going well on the continent and was extremely expensive to the English crown. Parliament had originally preferred attacking Spain with a less expensive naval assault on the Spanish colonies in North America. But when English forces struggled on the continent against the Spanish, Parliament began to attempt to limit Charles's funds and therefore limiting the Duke of Buckingham's funds. They wanted Duke of Buckingham impeached. So when they called for this, Charles dissolves Parliament in 1625. La Rochelle, if you remember, La Rochelle was the stronghold of the Huguenots in France. the Duke of Buckingham sent an expeditionary force to relieve the French Huguenots who was fighting Richelieu and the royal forces of France. And earlier, the Duke had helped Richelieu and the French against the Huguenots, which was very unpopular, but it was in exchange for support against the Spanish, who had taken over the Palatinate in the 30 Years' War. So he's kind of changing tunes here, and why is he doing it is he's thinking if he can help the Huguenots against the French, then it will save his hide, and people will welcome him back in good graces. But again, like I said, military support for the Protestants on the continent in itself was popular in both Parliament and with the Protestant majority in general. But it had the potential to alleviate concerns brought about by the king's Catholic merit. So this is kind of a cover-up, an attempt to get Charles and the Duke of Buckingham back in good graces. But the problem is it's a fiasco, and it's embarrassing, and it's expensive. He lost more than 4,000 of his force of 7,000 men. Parliament wanted the Duke impeached, as I mentioned earlier, but Charles balked at their attempt to play a role in the fate of his advisors. It didn't matter because the Duke of Buckingham is eventually assassinated by an angry army officer who doesn't approve of his military leadership. So, Charles I and Parliament. Parliament starts to gradually begin to try to deny funds to the crown. And again, it's kind of tradition in England, going back to the Magna Carta, that the king needs to include the Parliament or call Parliament to ask them for money. So we've talked about he's constantly at war. He always needs money or pounds, and he's always looking for different ways on how to get it. But he starts having forced loans and selling certain titles, which were offensive to a lot of people. To him, it was like, hey, I'm the absolute monarch. This is what we do. He also started imprisoning people with no trial, no habeas corpus, who wouldn't comply. And he also started quartering troops in people's houses to kind of pay for things, but also to keep an eye on them. He also used a medieval form of forced taxation. Those with a certain amount of wealth had to pay it, and this type of tax was called ship money. Ship, as in S-H-I-P. Excuse me. Just want to clarify. Ship money. And it had been collected in only coastal areas dating back to even 1588, and it was kind of a tax to pay the crown and to pay the military to protect the major ports. And, again, when they were being attacked in 1588, people could say, you know what, all right, I'll pay this tax because it's going to benefit me. But now he claimed that he could collect this tax all over England, even in areas that didn't have ports, since the Navy protected all of England. As you can imagine, the people internally are going to be like, what are you doing, dude? But the bottom line is, he keeps asking for more money, and they flat out don't give him everything that he wants. So here you see basically all the counties were required to pay to outfit ships for protection, where before it was only the coastal towns that needed protection. Almost every revolution, boys and girls, has to do with taxes, but here's a diagram of the ship money in 1636. His war with Spain continued to go bad, and he had to beg Spain for mercy, and it made England look very, very bad, very embarrassing. Remember, Spain was already weakened by this point, and England has to bow and succumb to them. Remember, Parliament had originally preferred attacking Spain with a less expensive naval assault style in the Spanish colonies in North America. But when Charles summons Parliament for more money once again in 1628, they issue something called the Petition of Rights. Probably something you do want to write down, the Petition of Rights in 1629. It's a landmark legal decision, and the king had to observe the rights of his subjects, which, again, demanded an end to the billeting of troops in private homes, quartering troops, and trials by martial law. It also declared arbitrary taxation and imprisonment as illegal. So it kind of puts checks and balances, if you will, on Charles. A year later, Charles I dissolves Parliament over their meddling in state religion and sends them home. He pretty much rules as an absolute monarch from the period of 1629 to 1640. This is also known as his personal rule, in which he actually created a lot of money, and which had offended the gentry. He raised enough to basically not need Parliament. He balanced his budget in 1637 with the help of ship money, and he also applies mercantilistic theories of crown and granting monopolies to gain money, even though there wasn't a statute prohibiting it.